Is Darcy Demi? An Exploration of Sexuality by Cowrie Fish. Introduction. We Pride and Prejudice fans have talked about Mr. Darcy a lot. Was he shy? Was he a snob? Was he neurodivergent? Today, I explore another possible lens by which we modern folks can examine him, the possibility that he was demisexual. Hi, I'm Cowrie Fish. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Darcy's sexuality. I've been writing Pride and Prejudice variation erotica for 2 decades. You can find my writings on fanfic.net, Archive of Our Own, AO3, and Patreon. There are links on my webpage, cowriefish.net, where you'll also find a transcript of this presentation at cowriefish.net/demi. I've read fic examinations of Darcy's sex drive, from the classic Under Good Regulation, wherein his regularly scheduled masturbation session take a beating from Elizabeth's presence at Netherfield, to Necessity, where his 3 carefully curated maids prove insufficient to take care of his needs. Long I have felt that the normal sexual patterns of a Regency gentleman do not fit his character. My work has always centered the virgin Darcy, holding himself aloof from the peccadillos common to his time, largely because of Wickham's bad example. Only recently have I begun to consider that his sexuality might have an even deeper divergence from societal norms. Today, I will examine the text for any hints about Darcy's sexual being, compare them to our definition of demisexuality, and examine them in the context of English society of Austen's time. I will also examine my own works for my developing understanding of his sexuality. And while my works contain many explicit descriptions of sexual activity, I have not included any in this presentation. Definitions. What is demisexuality? The Demisexual Resource Center defines demisexuality as a sexual orientation in which someone feels sexual attraction only to people with whom they have an emotional bond. They add that demisexuals rarely feel sexual attraction compared to the general population, and surveys indicate that some have less interest in sexual activity than people of other sexual orientations. Are demis ace? Demisexuality is considered as part of the asexual spectrum, contrasted to those who are allosexual, who experience sexual attraction outside of the context of emotional bond. Many demisexual people experience no sexual desire until they meet someone with whom they form the right emotional bond. I believe that this is a key part of understanding Darcy's sexuality. Disclaimer. One's sexuality is a process of self-discovery, and I believe can only be revealed by oneself. As Darcy is a fictional character, written in an era that did not yet recognize different sexualities, and in a form that did not allow for the exploration of sexuality, I will be engaging in much conjecture from little evidence. Heads up, I'll be answering questions in the comments and Discord, so please feel free to ask away. The cultural context. The English Regency was a period of classical culture. It wasn't just women's clothing and sculptures that were influenced by the contemporary notions of Greco-Roman culture, but manners. While Romantic periods are noted for an emphasis on sentiment, classical periods are marked by an emphasis on control, and the Regency was no exception. Men were supposed to be exemplars of control. The husband was the head of the family, legally owning his wife due to the British legal concept of coverture. He was responsible for not only his own conduct, but that of his wife and children. Mr. Darcy, as the head of his house, guardian to his sister, and master of an estate, would have been expected and raised to control himself impeccably under most circumstances. This complicates the analysis of his behavior, as being withdrawn and reticent would be among the behaviors expected of a gentleman in his position. In my analysis, where the text of the novel lacks, I fill in the gaps with history as much as I can as Austen would have understood it. Context. Darcy is a 28-year-old gentleman at the start of Pride and Prejudice. Darcy says that his father sent Wickham to Cambridge, and as we have no direct intelligence about Darcy's education, it is fair to assume that he also attended Cambridge. As his father had died 5 years before the events of Pride and Prejudice, we have no reason to think that he would have been withdrawn from school early to take on the duties of inheritance, so we can assume that he left when he was 18, as was standard at the time. That means he would have been out in society for 9 seasons when we meet him in the fall of 1811. Well did Elizabeth call him a man of education who had seen the world, even if he had stayed in England rather than going on the grand tour, which would have been made difficult due to Europe being at war. As his uncle, William Fitzwilliam, was an important politician with a socially active wife, she had arranged the marriage of her oldest, the Viscount Milton, to her niece. We can assume significant social pressure for Darcy to participate in seasons in town, to be introduced to eligible ladies, and to pursue marriage with one of them. As he is still single at the start of the novel, something must have intervened in this course of events. Was it his promised marriage to his cousin, Anne de Bourgh, or perhaps something deeper within him? Over and over again in the text, we see Darcy overwhelmed by his feelings, acting uncharacteristically and even in defiance of propriety in his dealings with Elizabeth. I believe that this is proof of how unused he was to having romantic feelings. As Austen's novels were written without direct references to sex, we must look for proxies. In Georgian society, dance was very much a proxy for sexual interaction. Thus, we can extrapolate Darcy's attitudes toward sex via his attitude toward dance. The other pattern that we see is in the differences between his interactions with Miss Bingley and with Elizabeth. He was already well acquainted with Miss Bingley at the start of the novel, and though intimate, see Caroline's liberties with believing she understood his feelings, did not seem to be attracted to her. What the text says, and this is sourced from Pemberley.com, the slight. The start of the novel contains the most substantial hint about the possibility that Darcy is demisexual, particularly in contrast with his reactions to Elizabeth, as opposed to Caroline Bingley. At the Meryton Assembly, Bingley urges Darcy to dance. Darcy responds, "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room with whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." Whereupon Bingley reproves him and suggests that he introduce Darcy to his partner's sister. "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till, catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Volume 1, Chapter 3. Being introduced at a dance was very standard in this era. In this very scene, Bingley is introduced to Jane immediately before asking her for a set. Thus, we are left to wonder if Darcy is just being over fastidious, as Bingley suggests, or if there's something deeper at play for him. The physical interplay of a Regency ballroom dance seems to be uncomfortable for him, if it is not with someone whom he knows well. This gives us the possibility that his sexual feeling is linked to emotional bond for him. Dancing was one of the few physical activities that unmarried persons were allowed to participate in together, along with parlor games such as blind man's buff and helping women into and out of carriages and over stiles. It was a key courtship activity. Here we might consider Darcy's reluctance to dance with strangers as merely a sign of fastidiousness. He would have been used to the versed circles of London society, and the reader might easily decide that Darcy felt that Hertfordshire society was savage in comparison. But it is in considering the two statements together that we see a pattern emerge. Darcy, though we later know him to be considerably attracted to Elizabeth, has no inclination for her at first, because he does not know her. It would be painful to dance with her because of that lack of emotional connection. The listening. In the next chapter, we see Darcy begin to feel attraction for Elizabeth. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. He began to wish to know more of her, and as a step toward conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. Darcy is beginning to feel attraction without having interacted with her directly, based on his judgment of the interaction between her appearance and her character. He puts himself in a position to get to know her without risking starting an interaction. Badly, as it turns out, his listening quickly turns into conversation with her. They speak, she teases him. Charlotte hustles her to the pianoforte to display. I'm convinced she was cognizant of Darcy's attraction before he was. Later in the party, Sir William encourages him to ask Elizabeth to dance. My dear Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is before you. And taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, who, though extremely surprised, was not unwilling to receive it. In between one meeting and the next, Darcy has become willing to dance with Elizabeth, and at a much less formal and thus presumably less acceptable occasion than the Meryton Assembly. And even when Elizabeth refuses to dance with him, he stands there, thinking about her. This is when Miss Bingley approaches him to attempt to draw him into her confederacy of disdain for Meryton society. His abstracted deflection of her attempt at intimacy, "What would I give to hear your strictures on them?" is blunt and utterly unfeeling. Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, and desired he would tell her what lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections. Mr. Darcy replied with great intrepidity, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. I think that we can agree that if he had any sensibility about Caroline's feelings toward him, he would have been more tactful in his response, respecting that she was his hostess at Netherfield and the sister of his friend. His insensitive response seems to speak to preoccupation with Elizabeth. His being acquainted with Bingley's sisters was enough for a dance, but not enough for the kind of attraction we see toward Lizzie. Miss Bingley responds with what should have been a winning tactic, pushing him. She asks when she is to wish him joy, that is, when he would marry Elizabeth. This is a classic technique for making someone rethink an inappropriate decision. But it backfires. Darcy seems untroubled. But it is possible that his calm covered the start of his great ambivalence that consumes the first part of the novel, his growing obsession with Elizabeth, warring with his conviction that it would be, in his own words, a reprehensible connection. Under the same roof. Darcy and Elizabeth's next interaction is in Volume 1, Chapter 7, when Elizabeth walks to Netherfield to inquire after Jane, who has fallen ill. She meets the company in the breakfast room. Darcy's thoughts are given as divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. We see here Darcy simultaneously bound by propriety, the unsuitability of a gentlewoman walking alone, and physical admiration for Elizabeth's person. This was underscored in the 1995 BBC adaptation, where Andrew Davis directed Firth to act as if Elizabeth's appearance caused a certain marked physical reaction in him. In Chapter 8, after Elizabeth had gone to attend Jane, the Netherfield party criticizes Elizabeth's appearance. This provides another opportunity for one of Darcy's retorts to Caroline's insults. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." Thus we see that Darcy's retorts to Caroline's attempts at intimacy are not just in crowded parties, but also in the privacy of home life. This conversation also includes Darcy's observations that the Bennet girls' low connections will prevent their marrying with men of any consideration in the world. This observation may simply be a reminder to Bingley of how the world works, but could also be viewed as directed to himself, that even if he allowed himself to wish to marry with her, it was out of the question. Their next interaction comes when the company is in the drawing room after dinner, and Elizabeth has joined them after tending Jane. Again, Darcy betrays his preoccupation with Elizabeth by referencing her height after Miss Bingley has called for him to compare Georgiana with herself, and then in claiming reading, the very activity in which Elizabeth is currently occupied, as one of the key accomplishments of a lady. In Chapter 9, Darcy is largely silent. Who can speak when Mrs. Bennet is in the room? But his choice of speech is again reflective of his romantic thoughts regarding Elizabeth. When she attempts to cut off her mother's bragging about Jane's not quite conquests with an observation about the effectiveness of poetry in ending love, he responds immediately. "I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love," said Darcy. "Of a fine, stout, healthy love, it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away." Darcy only smiled. Here we see Darcy amused by Elizabeth's wit, even in her mother's company. In Chapter 10, Elizabeth joins the party in the drawing room, where Bingley and Darcy's conversation draws her into a debate about persuasion. Here, even after stalwartly ignoring Caroline's attempts to draw him out to focus on his letter writing, Darcy is immediately drawn into conversation with her. Elizabeth then suggests he finish his letter, which he promptly does, then requests music. After Elizabeth displays, Miss Bingley takes the instrument. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards, Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question, with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," said she, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say, yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But I always delight in overthrowing these kind of schemes, and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. And now despise me if you dare." Indeed, I do not dare. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner that made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that if it were not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Here we have Darcy, in a very informal setting, making another attempt to dance with Elizabeth. In particular, I would draw your attention to how much umbrage Caroline would take at her display of accomplishment being used to court her rival. Darcy, taking this opportunity, was thus very bold, and Elizabeth's semi-rude response, full of arch sweetness or no, does not discourage him even slightly, only makes him remind himself that it is an impossible match. This trend continues to the end of the chapter, when he and Caroline are walking outside, Caroline twitting him about his supposed upcoming marriage to Elizabeth. He is calmly requesting her further input. One can easily imagine Darcy becoming angered by being accused of harboring such thoughts. We know he internally remands the impossibility of it to himself, but he seems to instead enjoy the opportunity to compliment Elizabeth to another. In Chapter 11, Elizabeth brings Jane down after dinner to socialize with the others. Caroline makes another ill-fated attempt to captivate Darcy, resorting to using her now rival by requesting her company in a walk around the room. This is immediately effective in drawing his attention. Darcy's admiration of their figures while walking seems directed primarily at Elizabeth, as he never has anything to say about Caroline's appearance. Darcy then enters into their conversation, which quickly turns both intimate and heated, ending with, "And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody. And yours," he replied with a smile, "is willfully to misunderstand them." Here we see him undisturbed by Elizabeth's near direct statement that he hates her, beginning, I believe, his pattern of thinking of her as speaking opinions which are not her own. This consistent misapprehension on his part, which marks this era of their relationship, is a powerful cognitive dissonance. He at once admires the forthrightness of her character, while ascribing all of her criticism of himself to playfulness. I have yet to see anyone engage in this level of self-deceit without powerful emotions being involved. This is underscored by the last sentence of the chapter, where Darcy reflects on the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. We do not know if this was danger to himself or the danger of raising her expectations of him, but regardless, it reveals that his emotions are strongly in play. In chapter 12, the Bennet sisters leave Longbourn. This short chapter gives us a significant glimpse into Darcy's feelings at the time. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him, nothing that could elevate her with the hope of influencing his felicity. Sensible that if such an idea had been suggested, his behavior during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book and would not even look at her. It seems that he has come to dislike Miss Bingley's teasing and to realize that his attentions had every chance of raising Elizabeth's expectations of a declaration from himself. Darcy would have been long schooled in the necessity of not engaging with a young lady without intending to propose. Such entanglements could ruin reputations, and since he liked Elizabeth, he seemed to have no thought of dallying with her and leaving her with her reputation in tatters. We also see that his willpower is equal to ignoring her, though they were left alone. This will change. The ball. Their last interaction in this volume is not until chapter 18, the Netherfield Ball. Here he approaches her to ask her to dance, this time successfully. The more formal setting of a private ball gives Lizzie less leeway to refuse him without having to sit out the rest of the night. And while we do not know that Darcy counted on this social reality, we cannot discount it. Such maneuvering would have been abhorrent to him if consciously done, so I tend to ascribe his approaching her for this third request to his attraction to her, which is now well established in the narrative. Elizabeth engages in tempestuous discourse with him, after deciding that conversation would be more of a punishment for him than silence. She needles him with his behavior toward Wickham, being rather rude, but Darcy responds politely, only growing cold as their set is ending. "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that report may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity." "I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours," he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence, on each side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable, powerful feeling toward her, which soon procured her pardon, and directed all his anger against another. Here we see Darcy wanting Elizabeth to not judge him based on Wickham's lies. Her opinion of him is important to him, and he would rather she suspend her judgment than judge against him. But despite his failure to convince her, he does not blame her for being taken in, and instead places the responsibility where it deserves, on the scoundrel Wickham. For the rest of the evening, he lingers near her, but does not attempt to further involve her in conversation. To me, this signals powerful but ambivalent feelings. This makes sense given her family's terrible display of manners. We can see why Darcy decided, only 2 days after the ball, to depart the county, never intending to return. This is her first rejection of him, more subtle than the second, but still marked for one of sensitive feelings, as Darcy shows himself to be. In Kent. Darcy and Elizabeth do not meet again until Volume 2, Chapter 30, when Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam come to Rosings to spend Easter with their aunt and cousin. The timing here is very interesting. It has been 116 days since Darcy left Hertfordshire, but the very next day after arriving, he comes with the Colonel to call upon the ladies at Hunsford Parsonage. We gather from Charlotte's reaction, who would have heard from Lady Catherine and the servants, both of the nephew's previous visits, that waiting upon them directly was not what she had expected. Charlotte's own acquaintance with Darcy and Meryton would not have required such a visit. We then gather that, despite Darcy's ambivalence and the months that passed without action on his part, that his desire to see Elizabeth remains strong. Darcy allows Colonel Fitzwilliam to lead the conversation, saying only the polite minimum. But when Elizabeth needles him about Jane being in town, he seems puzzled, as we know that he has concealed Jane's presence in town from Bingley, and yet he does not seem conscious of this. I diagnose that his feeling at being once again in company with Elizabeth, dominating his thoughts to the exclusion of all else. 6 days later begins the awkward interval in visiting, where Darcy calls upon Elizabeth often, but seems pressed for conversation. When he chooses the subject of their discourse, it betrays that his thoughts have been lingering on matrimonial possibilities. When Elizabeth responds with surprise to his characterization of the 50 miles between Meryton and Rosings as an easy distance, for context, the distance between Hertfordshire and Derbyshire is some 140 miles, he responds, "It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighborhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far." As he spoke, there was a sort of smile, which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane and Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered, "I do not mean to say that a woman might not be settled too near her family. The far and near must be relative and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expense of traveling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys, and I am persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance." Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her and said, "You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot always have been at Longbourn." Volume 2, Chapter 32. Darcy is revealing his private thoughts, that Elizabeth cannot possibly be very attached to her family, given how uncouth they are. His contradictory statements show how unsettled his views are. He first credits Elizabeth with attachment to home, then discounts her intentions to remain near. I think that this reveals what we will later discover, that he believes that his intentions are causing Elizabeth to become attached to him and to expect his declaration. His secret fantasies are making inroads into his perceptions of reality, as we would not expect them to do unless they were very powerful indeed. His conduct, as revealed by Elizabeth's meditations upon it, bear this out. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage, it was more difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips, and when he did speak, it seemed the effort of necessity rather than of choice. A sacrifice to propriety, not a pleasure to himself. He seldom appeared really animated. Darcy is seeking Elizabeth out, but sitting in silence, not speaking his mind, possibly constrained by the presence of others. In Chapter 33, we find him seeking her out while she is having her solitary walks, and there speaking more openly, if not coherently. It struck her, in the course of their third reconnoitre, that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins' happiness. and that in speaking of Rosings and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. His words seemed to imply it. Here in private, we see Darcy betraying more of his assumptions. He is thinking about their future life, about her accompanying him into Kent to enliven his visits of duty to his aunt, his anticipation of her pleasure in the walks at Pemberley. He has come to believe that he knows Elizabeth and that there is a growing bond of mutual feeling between them. This has blossomed into expectations of a union, both in his own mind and, it seems, in his belief about her thinking. I would point out that in the 8 days between his first visit to the parsonage and his proposal, he encountered Elizabeth 3 times. Without prior arrangement, it is wholly possible that those 3 meetings were the tip of the iceberg of his efforts to encounter her. He could have walked out every morning that he could escape from his aunt, and only encountered her those 3 times, walking away in disappointment the others. This shows how powerful his feeling for her was. As we would expect, an annual visit of this sort would be spent in visiting with his aunt and cousins. Also, Darcy has delayed their departure from Kent. The Colonel reveals this in his conversation with Lizzie in the next chapter. Despite a finite leave from his regiment on the Colonel's part, and one assumes he would rather spend that time in town, given how dull he tells Lizzie he finds Rosings when they first meet. This is strong evidence of ambivalence of feeling, else he would have made his declaration and left for town in good order. Darcy's declaration. This leads us to chapter 34 and the proposal. Colonel Fitzwilliam unwittingly exposed Darcy's interference between Jane and Bingley. Grieved, Elizabeth claims a headache and stays at the parsonage, while the others go for tea at Rosings. Darcy, discovering that she has stayed behind and surmising that she has created an opportunity for him to declare himself, heads over. The scene that follows is a tragedy of miscommunication. He believes that she is expecting his proposal and thus tempers it with explanations of why he is delayed. That is, insulting her family. She is puzzled to see him at all, utterly taken back by his proposal because, despite Charlotte's hints, she has never believed that he was interested in her. Her response startles and shocks him. Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. His complexion became pale with anger, and the disturbance of his mind was visible in every feature. He was struggling for the appearance of composure, and would not open his lips till he believed himself to have attained it. The pause was, to Elizabeth's feelings, dreadful. At length, in a voice of forced calmness, he said, "And this is all the reply which I am to have the honor of expecting. I might, perhaps, wish to be informed why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus rejected, but it is of small importance." We can have no doubt that he has convinced himself that Elizabeth shared his feelings. He believed in an emotional bond between them, and was dismayed to find that it did not exist. His lack of civility in the rest of the conversation speaks to this distress. Chapter 35 gives us Darcy's letter of explanation. It bears repeating that correspondence between unmarried ladies and gentlemen was beyond the pale of Regency manners. That he felt circumstances permitted it in this case speaks to his need to be understood. Back in Hertfordshire, he might have suggested that she suspend her analysis of him, but here there can be no delay in setting her to rights about the misconceptions. This seems to have nothing to do with alerting her to the possible danger from Wickham himself. If that was what concerned him, warning her before he left the county and not just before the militia might be expected to decamp from Meryton would have been more suitable. No, the letter is about justifying himself, correcting her misestimation of himself. In his letter, he also gives powerful testimony as to the state of his feelings, referring to the utmost force of passion that was present in his case, but he believed missing from Bingley's. Darcy must have spent the interval while Elizabeth was reading his letter in telling Colonel Fitzwilliam that he had shared the secret of Wickham and Georgiana's attempted elopement with her, because the Colonel remains at the parsonage long after Darcy has left, presumably by Darcy's request, so that he might testify to the veracity of Darcy's narrative regarding Wickham. I can imagine how difficult such a disclosure and request must be for one of Darcy's character, rather secretive and independent. Darcy then returns to town, presumably intending to never see Elizabeth again, similar to his departure from Hertfordshire. My take. Only in the last year was I exposed to the idea of demisexuality. When I did, I experienced an immediate recognition and feeling of belonging. But in going through my writing, I discovered that I had projected my own notion of demisexuality onto Darcy for years. It had always been my headcanon that Darcy's fastidious manner toward the opposite sex was in part a reaction to Wickham's attitude and behavior. Further, he idolized the relationship between his father and mother, which has led him to disdain less formal sexual arrangements in his own case. In the very first chapter of my first Darcy and Elizabeth fic, I Will Have You, Darcy pauses during his preparations to kidnap Elizabeth post-refusal to think. Elizabeth's fervent refusal haunted him. Her certainty, her strength of will highlighted her disinterest. His fantasies about their life together, already strong, became doubly potent, the only reality that mattered. She was the only woman who could look him in the eye and see him for himself. Life without that would be a meaningless farce. Once they are aboard the ship for Guernsey, he has leisure for self-reprimand. His once cherished dreams of Elizabeth's constant companionship at Pemberley were dashed by his newfound resolution to give her as much privacy as she desired. So strong had those dreams been in Kent that he found them appearing in his conversation with her. They felt so real that he spoke of her future, their future, with her. Here I betray a man who has deluded himself that he enjoyed mutual unspoken affection, devastated to learn that he had fooled himself. In First Night at Netherfield, one of my few canon-compliant stories, Darcy reflects on Elizabeth. The following day he felt himself drawn into the idea of her studying his character. He felt at once desirous of her so focused upon him, but singularly self-conscious of her doing so. He found himself unaccountably jealous of Bingley. Her arch observations upon him were not such as he wanted her to levy against himself, but he nonetheless resented that they were Bingley's portion. He feared he had made a fool of himself in his display for Miss Elizabeth's benefit, attempting to match her playfulness, much against his own habit. Any infatuated person might be jealous of their crush's attention, but here Darcy is particularly desirous of having her examining eye upon his inner being. He wishes her to know him, longs for the intimacy of her mind containing an accurate sketch of his character. In my first novel, A Teasing Courtship, Elizabeth accepts his proposal, planning to make it a torment before jilting him, and reveals that Jane has been feeling poorly. Darcy felt a tremor of fear at her words. "Why is your sister out of spirits?" he asked. She stopped sewing and looked up at him. "Do you truly not understand, Mr. Darcy? Her heart is broken. She was abandoned by one dear to her, and whom she hoped would become dearer still." The tremor became a spike of pain as conscience smote him. He had been so sure that Miss Bennet cared nothing for Bingley, sure enough to fuel vehement assurances. But Elizabeth said that it was otherwise, that her sister's affections had been thoroughly engaged, that she suffered for abandonment. It was terrible. Here we see Darcy's fear response at coming to understand that he had misunderstood something close to Elizabeth's heart, the state of her beloved sister's affections. The realization that he had misjudged and imperiled the understanding between them, he did not know that Elizabeth knew his part in parting them, was terrifying to him. In Claiming Her Rights, in which a compromise leads Darcy to marry Elizabeth, she discovers his discomfort with intimacy without assurance of mutual regard. Even before their unfortunate encounter in the Netherfield library, he is wishing for intimacy with her in particular. He could find no rest for his thoughts of her. When he closed his eyes, she was before him, her brilliant eyes fixed upon his, a delicious smile upon her lips. In both, he found invitation into the mysteries of the female person, eschewed until now, and in large part thanks to Wickham's example. But in Elizabeth, he found a holy fire of desire, sanctified by mutual regard. And now, armed with a fuller understanding, I've drafted something yet more pointed in my newest Patreon story, Lettered. In this story, when Darcy attempts to give Lizzie his letter, he suffers second thoughts which lead to a display of ungentlemanlike passion on his part. They return to Longbourn and become engaged. This dialogue is from a private conversation where Lizzie is attempting to make out his motivations. "Is it that you do not think of me as a gentlewoman, though I am a gentleman's daughter?" she asked. He shook his head, confounded by the remnant of his vigorous nod, catching his neck awkwardly. "Then why?" she demanded. "I don't know," he confessed, ashamed to stay so long silent and yet have nothing to say. "Has such a thing happened before?" she inquired. His head shook violently. "No," he cried. She put her finger before her lips meaningfully, her eyes rebuking him. He quailed. "Do you mean that you've never felt this way, or that you've never done that to another woman?" she persisted. His neck cracked with how suddenly he shook his head. "Not ever, neither," he whispered adamantly. "But I cannot be the first you've liked," she probed, disbelieving. His nod was emphatic. She looked at him incredulously. "But Miss Bingley said you've spent many seasons in town," she objected. "6," he agreed. "Surely you met with agreeable ladies," she asserted. He shrugged. "You liked none of them?" she asked, aghast. I, Darcy attempted, but could not find speech until he had struggled some moments. "I had decided that they were romancing when they spoke of attraction," he admitted, "because they had read it in a novel, not because they actually felt it." Here I depict Darcy as certain that a romantic attraction is make-believe, never having experienced it for himself until he was overwhelmed by it in getting to know Elizabeth. It is that contrast, going from total assurance that he understood everything to loss of control and panic at realizing that he was subject to passion beyond his command, that I believe is at the heart of his character arc. Reflections. I've rarely encountered a fictional character who incited such powerful reactions in me and Darcy. This is evident by how much I've tortured him in my stories, sometimes literally. For me, Darcy not only stands for moneyed male white privilege, but the luxury of holding oneself apart from one's fellow human beings, judging them from as if on high. It is easy for demisexuals, in my experience, to look down on allosexuals as having a lesser sexual experience. That judgment is something that I've struggled with for much of my adult life, and I believe is what Darcy had to come to terms with in coming to terms with his being in love with Elizabeth. Loving her was messy. He knew that her family would forever be drawing him into their drama. In rescuing Lydia, he not only rescued Elizabeth herself from reputational ruin, but proved to himself that he could dive into the filth of Wickham's mess and come out clean in his own opinion. This is a powerful example of coming to accept the world on its own terms, while holding fast to one's own concept of self, of learning to let go of what is peripheral while retaining that which was truly important. And in the end, while I admit that it is impossible to properly prove that Austen had any particular understanding of Darcy's sexuality, I believe there is sufficient proof to support my reading of the text. I'm very interested to hear what you think. Please chime in with your take in the comments and in the Discord. Want more? I explore the possibilities in Pride and Prejudice, focused primarily on the relationship between Darcy and Elizabeth. My stories generally start with a single divergence from canon, such as a different decision made. For example, in I Will Have You, Darcy deciding to kidnap Elizabeth rather than accept her refusal, and explore that possibility as much within the constraints of canon and the historical reality of the time as I'm able. I'm a self-published author and have published 3 novels, A Teasing Courtship, A Darkness in Hertfordshire, A Secret Understanding, and Each Time They Might Have Kissed, a collection of 16 short stories about first kisses between our dear couple. My next release will be On Bended Knee, Each Time They Might Have Groveled, a short story collection featuring Darcy begging for forgiveness. You'll find me on Amazon, on Patreon, on AO3, and fanfic.net. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you on Discord and in the comments.